The strange thing about financial collapses is that they rarely look like collapses in the beginning. At first, everything appears normal. The stock market still moves. People still go to work. Governments still promise stability. And television still tells you the economy is strong. But underneath the surface, something begins to rot. And when people finally recognize it, the damage has already been done. What I'm about to say may sound uncomfortable, but throughout history, nations buried under enormous debt have always reached the same crossroads. And they almost never choose the honest path, because the honest path is painful. Instead, they choose something far more dangerous. Not default, something quieter, something slower, something that transfers wealth without most people realizing it's happening. And if you understand this process early, you can protect yourself while others are still confused. So today we're going to talk about why America probably won't default on its debt, but why the solution policymakers choose could end up being worse for ordinary people than default itself. And before we begin, if you enjoy deep economic breakdowns that explain what's really happening beneath the headlines, make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel, because the next decade may reward informed people and punish distracted people. Now let's begin. There's a common belief that countries fail the same way businesses fail, that if debt gets too large, eventually the bills can't be paid. But sovereign nations with reserve currencies operate differently. The United States owes enormous amounts of money, trillions upon trillions, and every year that debt grows larger. The interest payments alone are becoming staggering. Now, most people hear this and imagine one dramatic event. America misses payments. The system crashes overnight. Panic everywhere. But historically, that's usually not how great powers handle debt crises. Because countries that control the world's reserve currency possess a tool ordinary people underestimate. They can create money, and that changes everything. If a country owes debt in a currency it can print, then technically, it can always pay. But here's the catch. Just because you can pay doesn't mean the value being repaid remains the same. And this is where the real danger begins. Imagine lending someone $100,000. Years later, they repay you in full. But the purchasing power of that money has been cut in half. Technically, you were repaid. In reality, you lost enormous wealth. That's the game history keeps repeating. Not direct default, currency debasement, silent default. And most populations never recognize it until living standards begin deteriorating. This is why debt cycles matter so much, because eventually governments reach mathematical limits. The debt becomes too large relative to economic growth. And once that happens, leaders only have a few choices: raise taxes aggressively, cut spending dramatically, default openly, or print money indirectly. Politically, only one of those options feels painless at first: printing, because people don't immediately connect money creation with declining purchasing power. At first, it can even feel positive. Asset prices rise, stocks go higher, real estate climbs, people feel wealthier. But beneath the surface, currency value slowly weakens. And once confidence begins breaking, the process accelerates. History is filled with examples: the Dutch Empire, the British Empire, countless major powers before them. They all experienced periods where debt exploded beyond sustainable levels, and nearly every time, leaders believed they could manage it indefinitely, until confidence changed. That's the word people ignore: confidence. Modern monetary systems run almost entirely on confidence. Confidence that bonds retain value. Confidence that currency purchasing power remains stable. Confidence that governments remain disciplined. Once confidence weakens, capital moves. Quietly at first, then suddenly. And when that transition begins, the effects ripple through every layer of society. Food prices rise. Housing becomes unreachable. Middle classes shrink. Wealth gaps widen. Not because productivity disappeared overnight, but because the monetary foundation changed. Now here's where things become extremely important. Most people think inflation is accidental, but historically, moderate inflation becomes a strategy. Why? Because inflation reduces the real burden of debt. If governments owe massive fixed debts and the currency loses value over time, the debt effectively becomes easier to repay. From the government's perspective, this feels manageable. From the citizen's perspective, it slowly destroys purchasing power. And this creates one of the largest hidden wealth transfers in society. People holding cash become poorer. People holding hard assets often become wealthier. That divide changes nations. You can already see hints of this process emerging. The average person feels financially pressured despite official economic numbers appearing stable. Why? Because real life operates differently than headlines. People don't measure prosperity through government reports. They measure it through groceries, rent, energy, healthcare, opportunity. And when those rise faster than income, people feel the system changing, even if they can't explain why. Now let me explain something even more dangerous. Debt crises rarely happen in isolation. They usually collide with political conflict. Internal division rises. External competition intensifies. Populations become frustrated, and leaders under pressure often choose short-term stability over long-term discipline. That's human nature, that's political reality, and that's historical repetition. The problem is, short-term solutions compound long-term fragility. More borrowing, more intervention, more money creation, until eventually the entire structure becomes dependent on constant support. At that point, reversing course becomes nearly impossible, because the system itself becomes addicted. This is why major turning points feel gradual, then sudden. For years, people say, this can continue forever. Then suddenly, this was obvious all along. And by then, wealth has already shifted. Now I want to be very clear about something. This does not mean society collapses tomorrow. History is far more nuanced than sensational headlines. Powerful nations can extend debt cycles for surprisingly long periods. Innovation still happens, markets still rise, companies still grow. But underneath that progress, the monetary structure can weaken simultaneously. Both realities can exist together, and that confuses people, because they assume economic strength automatically means financial stability. Not always. Some of the strongest looking periods in history occurred late in major debt cycles. That's because liquidity can temporarily create the illusion of prosperity, but eventually reality catches up. The key question isn't, will America default? The key question is, what form will the restructuring take? Open default destroys confidence immediately. Silent debasement spreads pain gradually. Politically, gradual pain is often preferred, even if economically it becomes destructive over time. Now think about this carefully. If policymakers continue creating money faster than real productivity grows, then the currency supply expands faster than actual value creation. And when more currency chases limited real goods, prices rise. That's not politics. That's arithmetic. The frightening part is that once inflation psychology becomes embedded, it becomes difficult to reverse. People spend faster. Businesses raise prices preemptively. Workers demand higher wages. The cycle feeds itself. Then central banks face impossible choices: raise rates aggressively and risk recession, or continue supporting liquidity and risk further currency weakening. Neither path feels painless. That's the stage many debt-heavy systems eventually reach. And historically, that's when social tension rises dramatically. Because inflation affects psychology differently than recession. Recession creates fear. Inflation creates frustration. People feel punished despite working harder. That emotional shift matters enormously. Now here's the part most people misunderstand. The goal is not fear. Fear clouds judgment. The goal is understanding cycles early enough to position intelligently. History rewards people who remain calm during structural change. Not emotional, not reactive, not ideological, calm. Because every major transition creates both destruction and opportunity simultaneously. The people who survive these periods best usually do a few things. They diversify intelligently. They avoid excessive debt. They focus on productive assets. They build adaptable skills. And most importantly, they stop assuming the future will look exactly like the past. That mental flexibility matters more than predictions. Nobody knows the exact timeline, but cycles do exist. Debt cycles, political cycles, monetary cycles, empire cycles. Ignoring them doesn't stop them. Now let's talk about the deeper issue beneath all of this: trust. Every financial system ultimately depends on trust. Once populations begin losing trust in institutions, the effects compound quickly. People speculate more, consume differently, vote differently, invest differently, and rebuilding trust is far harder than maintaining it. That's why great powers throughout history rarely collapse purely from external enemies. Most weaken internally first. Financial stress, political division, social fragmentation. Then external competition accelerates existing weakness. This pattern repeats so consistently throughout history that ignoring it becomes dangerous. But remember this carefully. Periods of transition are not only periods of decline. They are also periods where entirely new systems emerge. New technologies, new industries, new leadership structures, new economic winners. Every major restructuring creates a transfer of wealth and power, and people paying attention early often position themselves ahead of that transition. That's why understanding macroeconomic reality matters, not for panic, for preparation. Because if the next decade becomes defined by currency debasement, financial repression, and rising instability, then traditional assumptions about saving, investing, and wealth preservation may no longer work the same way they once did. And the people who adapt slowly may find themselves trapped. Now I want you to think about one final idea. Throughout history, the biggest financial dangers were rarely the events everyone feared publicly. They were the slow-moving structural shifts happening quietly underneath society. The shifts most people ignored because daily life still felt normal, until suddenly it didn't. That's why the phrase, "America won't default," can be technically true, while average citizens still experience massive declines in purchasing power, affordability, and financial stability. And that may ultimately feel worse than default itself. Not because the system disappears overnight, but because people slowly realize the rules changed while they were distracted. The next decade may become one of the most important economic transitions of our lifetimes. And in periods like that, understanding reality early becomes an enormous advantage. If you found this breakdown valuable, like the video and subscribe to the channel for more deep macroeconomic analysis and long-form financial storytelling. Because the world is changing faster than most people realize, and the people who understand the cycle may be the ones best prepared for what comes next.